I'll welcome people in about 2 or 3 minutes, if that's okay.
I'm not sure what it means to be live, but I celebrate liveliness. I'm very honored to be your guest.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And we're very grateful to the JBC, the Jewish Book Council, for facilitating this and making you and your work accessible to us at this very important time, of course. It works out perfectly. So, okay.
Okay.
I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes and then we'll start. People are entering the webinar, and I'll just wait, make sure that we get everyone in. Okay, I think we'll begin. Let me welcome you. We're less than a week away from Passover, and we couldn't have a better, more interesting, exciting person to learn from than Professor Vanessa Oakes, who is Professor of Religion and Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. She received her PhD from Drew University in 1998, and she was ordained as rabbi in 2012. This wonderful book that she's going to be talking about, the Passover Haggadah, I'm holding it up, the Passover Haggadah Biography, it belongs to a series that the University of Princeton is publishing on the lives of great religious books. That's such a neat idea. And to have this as one of the books in that series, I think is absolutely fantastic. It's a wonderful book. It's a great gift. And as all of you know, our friends at Chaucer's Bookstore have it. And if you want to buy it as a Passover gift to send to a family member, to send to relatives who are not going to be with except perhaps through Zoom, it's a great gift. And I'm going to remind you of that at the end of our talk this afternoon. But let me say a bit more about our speaker today, who I've been wanting to meet for many years. Among her most important books are Words on Fire, One Woman's Journey into the Sacred, which was revised in 1999, a book that is just an extraordinary commentary on portions of the Hebrew Bible entitled Sarah Laughed, which was originally published by McGraw-Hill in 2004, and then it was reissued in 2011 by the Jewish Publication Society of America. And then one of the most important books, I think, in the study of religion and also the study of Judaism, her book, Inventing Jewish Ritual, which was published by JPS, Jewish Publication Society, in 2007 and won the Jewish Book Council's award for the best book in Jewish thought in 2011. Now, I want to just comment on Sarah Laughed because we used it. I belong to a Torah study group on Friday morning with Rabbi Chaim Beliak, and I believe that some members of our Torah study group are here. They've been waiting to listen to you, Vanessa. It's a superb commentary, really, really superb. We read it with Rashi and Ibn Ezra and all those guys, but I think most of us felt you made more sense than they did. So among her many chapters in edited books and in scholarly journals are a particular interest in Jewish ritual. So among her articles is an article entitled Same-Sex Marriage Ceremonies. And as her research has developed, she seems to have focused more and more on domestic Jewish material culture, if I can call it that. And that is, as I was telling her earlier, a very, very interesting intellectual move to make in one's scholarship, but it's a part of a trajectory into which this book, the Passover Haggadah, fits very neatly. And she's now working on another project that will probably take some additional time before it comes out on Jewish homes and domestic objects in Jewish homes, the materiality of our Jewish life. So Vanessa, welcome to Santa Barbara. We would love to have you here in the real, and perhaps we'll be able to do that after COVID is done and gone and we are liberated from the virus. We welcome you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It was just such a beautiful introduction. Don't we all yearn to be understood? And you clearly get what I'm trying to do in my work. So thank you so much. It was over 20 years ago when I was planning to lecture in Los Angeles, and one of my former students told me that LA is near Santa Barbara, and if I was going to be that close to Santa Barbara, I absolutely needed to make a trip up there as well. She would come get me so I could see that Santa Barbara was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. And I went, and she was right. And she took me before I was about to get onto a little van that would take me to the LA airport. She took me to this outdoor farmers market. I'm sure you know the name of it, but I didn't know the name of it. And the vegetables that were being sold were, like, to my East Coast eye, they were all on steroids. And I saw what I thought was the largest bunch of scallions I had ever seen in my life. It turned out they were red onions. They were not scallions, but I had to purchase them because it was right before Passover, and I was about to fly directly to my mother-in-law's house. These were people who, my in-laws, did no Jewish holidays other than Passover, and they did Passover with a vengeance. I mean, they just really did Passover, and so I thought if I would bring these giant onions to their house, they could have a much more engaged holiday. It was already quite engaged, but it would brighten up the holiday even more. And so when it came time for Dayenu, of course, many of you know the ritual that in certain Sephardic homes that people take scallions and they beat each other with them. And I thought my Santa Barbara onions would really make a good splash because they're big green things coming out of them. What I didn't know was that my mother-in-law would take the big red bulb, and when it came time to do the Dayenu part, where we would beat each other, she really mercilessly pelted the various in-laws that she didn't care for all that much. Fortunately, I realized I was doing okay because she turned the onions around and gave me a few gentle tweaks. That was the Passover that my father-in-law did something that was quite extraordinary. Again, as I said, they were not really Jewish holiday people, but when it came to Passover, we did it, and there was always this Uncle Harold, who would always talk about, and Rabbi Jose, and that would make him crack up, the idea that there was a rabbi named Rabbi Jose, and everyone wasn't paying much attention. And my father-in-law took his Haggadah and he just slammed it down on the table, and he said, "After all these years, no one knows the Exodus story." And he went into his little study. We had just given him a translation, Everett Fox's translation of Torah. And he comes back and he opens up Exodus. He says, "For once and for all, you are going to know the story of the Exodus." And he proceeded to read it. We went from the burning bush into Egypt, through the plagues, the night of watching. We went across the sea. We didn't get our way through Sinai. We wandered a little bit in the desert. It was the longest Passover of our lives. But it was a beautiful night too, because it made it clear to me and to everybody else how problematic a Haggadah can be. That we can go through it year after year after year. And the simplest thing, knowing the story, which we expect Jewish kids in preschool to know. I have a little grandson who's 4.5, and he goes to Jewish preschool. He knows the whole story by now. But many adults can go to Seder's for their whole lives, and they don't really know the story from their Haggadahs, and that is rather, that's confusing. So I was asked to write this book by Fred Apple at Princeton University Press. He's explained that this was part of a series of the biographies of great religious books, and I thought it was wonderful that he and his team thought the Haggadah was one of these. I certainly did, because I just love Haggadahs. And before I really thought very much about it, I said, yes, I'll do this, because I figured I knew so much about, as someone who writes about new ritual, I knew so much about the contemporary Haggadot that I thought this wouldn't be all that hard. Plus, I could get myself a sabbatical, and I could spend time going through my friends' bookshelves in America and in Israel, and going to museums and going to libraries, and really spending time looking at Haggadot. And that's when I realized how much I didn't know. It's one thing to know about the contemporary Haggadah, but you got to know about the emergence of the Haggadot, of the Haggadah text in the Talmud and in the 9th century, and then the illuminated Haggadot of the Middle Ages, and then that great era of printing, and I didn't know very much about that at all, and then new eras of illumination, and then the Haggadah in the kibbutz in Israel, and the socialist Haggadot in the United States, and then the Reform Haggadah, and so on and so on. There was so much to learn, and I confess it was a little bit overwhelming. Fortunately, I had my heart in the right place, and my heart was set in the right place from the very beginning of my process, when I was sent by my really beloved colleague, Professor Larry Hoffman from HUC. He sent me off to Chicago to visit the preeminent American collector of Haggadot, Stephen Derschlag. And Mr. Derschlag was very open to my coming to visit him, to see this incredible collection. And I just want to share this with you. It's in my book, and I share it with you because this particular encounter meant the world to me. And maybe it touches on some of your own feelings and deep understandings about the Haggadah if you've used it for many years. And I say Haggadah. Usually I should say the nice Hebrew Haggadah, but I was raised in an Ashkenazic home, and we always said Haggadah. So that's my default. So so let me share, if I may, this story with you. I arrived along the shore of Lake Michigan. This was Chicago's Gold Coast, and I stood in front of the grand building where Mr. Derschlag, who invited me to call him Steve, lived, hoping I was presentable. It was an unusually hot and sunny fall day. When I entered his modern art-filled apartment overlooking the city and lake, he offered me a drink. And I said, water would be lovely. I felt awe and excitement. Steve ushered me into his wood-shelved library where his Haggadot were housed. Rare ones were there on the shelves, not even behind glass, but placed along with his other books, even paperbacks, even the popular vegetarian Haggadah. He selected treasures to show me, rapidly placing one on top of the next on a glass display table in the center of the room. Here was the 1629 Venice Haggadah, the 1695 Amsterdam Haggadah, and now the 1712 Amsterdam Haggadah with its fold-out map of the biblical world. I could hardly keep up with these wonders. Steve didn't insist I coddle each Haggadah on a special foam rest, as I had in the libraries of rare book collections. This was liberating, but what if I stressed the binding? He didn't ask me to put on those special white gloves that special collections librarians made me wear. And I didn't have to use one of those little bowling alley pencils. I was able to use my own pencil, my own pen. I could have been perusing the very modest shelf of stacked up Haggadot in my living room, a collection most rich in supermarket Haggadahs and the Maxwell House Haggadot my mother had amassed over the years, not as exemplars of ephemera, but for us to use. I was anxious for the safety of Steve's books. Didn't they need a more watchful eye, some protection, safe from me? And I'll just stop for just a moment to show you, this is one of my great treasures. This is the ShopRite Passover Haggadah. If you think you have a treasure, if you don't have this, I'm sorry. There is no competing. There is no competing with this one. Not only does it have a Passover shopping list, but, and here's the pièce de résistance, a centerfold with coupons for Kedem grape juice, Roquer or Rukich gefilte fish, Ratner's Passover blintzes. This is a very late 90s kind of document. I mean, can you imagine a book of Lamentations with coupons for Kleenex, or a Book of Mormon with coupons for money off for your LensCrafter glasses? I mean, this is quite extraordinary. Anyway, back to the scene at Mr. Derschlag's apartment. Distracting myself from these worrisome thoughts, I asked Steve how he had found his Haggadot, thinking he might have some miraculous discovery stories. He answered by matter-of-factly pulling off a Sotheby's catalog and then a Kestenbaum's catalog, and he pointed to a new purchase that was still in an unopened padded mailer, and more were on the way. The tower of Haggadot he was piling on the table for me grew higher and higher. Haggadot from Pune, India, Paris, South Africa, Shanghai, Melbourne, Munich. He declared it was time to clear off this batch and to make room for others. Inebriated by gratitude, to be present, to witness this wondrous collection, I enthusiastically stretched out my right arm over the books on the table, ready to help sweep them up so that I could see even more rare Haggadot. I had failed to notice that on this very hot day, Steve had also gotten himself a drink, a bottle of Diet Cola, and it had been on the table all along, and it was uncapped. Now, thanks to my outstretched arm, it was spilling all over the table of Haggadot. So I prayed, oh dear God, if the soda damages just the Sotheby's catalog, Dayenu, it would be enough. Or just the Sotheby's and also the Kestenbaums, also Dayenu. I started to turn towards Steve, anticipating his horror and displaying my shame. But during my liturgical interlude, he had dashed off and had returned with a shmata, a little towel. He was already clearing, dabbing, mopping, and reassuring me, you cannot treat them as artifacts or they lose their value. That is when I understood in my mind what I knew in my heart, that while an individual Haggadah may be collected and cherished for its historical or artistic merits, it lives as its most authentic self when it is used, especially on the family's Passover Seder table. That is when it gets a life, so to speak. In that place of vulnerability, subject to wine spills and the assault of matzah crumbs, it choreographs the transmission of particular memories and inculcates sensibilities. So yes, I would go on to learn that Haggadah comes to life when it leads those who have gathered to use it to ask hard questions about slavery, exile, and redemption, and freeing the oppressed. Its liveliness increases each time it is taken out again to be used at a Seder, and each time celebrants use it. It's especially lively, but in a different way, when it fades into the background and gives rise to the conversation of those seated at the Seder table, those who are alive at the present moment, and make the telling of the Passover story meaningful for themselves. So I just want to share with you some images, and I'm going to ask Alma if she can show the first image on the screen of my little slideshow. And here we have this question that I've been wondering about when I was sort of overwhelmed by how many Haggadot there were. Why has the Haggadah been revised so many thousands of times? And back when people were still writing bibliographies of the Haggadah, and this was back in the 60s or 70s or so, the number was 6,000, usually was 6,000. And it would come with another number that you would see in articles that were written about the holiday annually, usually in the New York Times and other places. The other big number was that 90% of Jews go to a Passover Seder, which is a really marvelous number. And I don't know about you, but in my not Jewish friends, clamoring for a Seder invitation is a really big thing these days. But I was wondering, like, why so many? And by the way, there is no counting anymore. Ever since a website called Haggadot.com came into being, and you have got to look at this. You must go to Haggadot.com, because this is an incredible website which allows you to make your own Haggadah using all kinds of bits and pieces of other people's Haggadahs. You can add your own images, your own text, your own videos now. This is the Haggadah of the moment. And yes, they had a COVID-ready Haggadah last year. And this year there's there's year 2 of COVID, which those Haggadah, maybe we'll talk about that in the questions, how they're different this year. So if we can look at the next slide, and the one right after that, actually, the one after that, we'll skip to the one after. So if you go on Amazon, you will see just how many Haggadot were available just last year. One of the more popular ones is A Different Night by Mishael Zion, and there's an updated version of that. Last year, the Trump Haggadah was still there, and you might even see some of the Haggadahs that you've used over the years. So it's like, why so many? So if we can go to the next slide. I went to many experts of the Haggadah, particularly people who collected them and who were in charge of the collections in major libraries. And I said, why so many? And they said to me 4 reasons: geography, history, practice, and technology. And I want to breezily take you through some of those responses, which I uncover in my book, which I go era by era. I start in the biblical period, and I find the sort of the glimmers of the Haggadah. A Haggadah doesn't emerge really as a text for quite a long time. But let's look at some of these images. If we can go to the next slide, please. So wherever Jews have lived, there have been Haggadot. The one on our left is the it's called the Washington Haggadah because it's in the Washington Library. This is from Germany. The one on the right is from Barcelona. It's now in Sarajevo, and there's a wonderful account of this Haggadah, imaginative one, in a book called The People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. It's just incredible. And I write at great length about this Sarajevo Haggadah in my book. Or wherever Jews have lived, whatever languages Jews have spoken, there have been Haggadot created in those places. And not always, the artists have not always been Jewish, because Jews were not always able to be part of the guild of illuminators. The texts were indeed written by Jews. And so we'll look at the next image, please. Next slide. And here we see a Haggadah, 19th century Haggadah in India, reflecting Jewish life in India. And we see one from the 19th century from Trieste. And we see a scene at a very fancy Italian table. And this is pretty characteristic. You even see this in the Maxwell House Haggadahs, which I'm sure many of you have seen these, that there's always an elegant table that's portrayed with the finest china, in this case, a fabulous chandelier, gorgeous curtains. The ladies are wearing their most beautiful gowns for the day. So these most photos of pictures of families in Haggadot are aspirational. They show people at their very best. We'll go to the next slide, please. And we'll move to the next one. Changes in practice have also been reflected in the Haggadah. Certainly, every Jewish movement in America has its own Haggadah. One of the loveliest ones that a movement produced was the 1984 Feast of Freedom Haggadah, created by which the Rabbinical Assembly put that one together, and the Israeli artist Dan Reisinger used a dramatically different kind of picture of the 4 children. They still look like sons here. This was before we made a point of speaking of these as 4 children. But we see that if you look at the image, you'll see how each child has parts of the other child in him, meaning that we are all wise, we are all wicked, we are all lacking questions, we are all simple. Go to the next slide, please. Brand new practices have created a place for themselves in the brand new Haggadot. early on in the early Jewish feminist Haggadot, coming out beginning in the 70s and increasing, we saw this ritual of the orange on the Seder plate. And I can talk about that during questions if you'd like. But the newer Haggadot, newer family Haggadot, as they were published, began to have, it wasn't just a feminist Haggadah that had a place for an orange on the Seder plate. It was family Haggadah. Go to the next slide. So clearly everybody knows about Elijah's cup, which we see on the left. But now many Haggadot, again, family Haggadot, have a ritual for Miriam's cup, a cup of spring water, which recognizes the role of Miriam and other women in the Passover story. Usually it's a cup that's filled with fresh spring water, sometimes from the very beginning, as Elijah's cup is filled with wine, and sometimes each member of those who are, every person who's at the table puts a little bit of water in the cup to show a kind of participation in healing, in coming together. In my family, we use this opportunity to think about Miriam's optimism, and we honor someone. Each of us we go around and we honor someone who has helped us to, especially in dark times, to see the brighter side. Go to the next one, please. So this is pretty funny. One of the practices that Jews observe when it comes to using a Haggadah, it's an ancient technique, and you need to be very, very erudite in order to practice this technique. It's called skipping. It's called skipping along, like doing some of it. And probably every family has its version of skipping something. And many families have as their ritual getting to the part where it says, serve the festive meal, and then the Haggadot are collected, never to be seen until either the next day or the next year. This is part of a super funny one. This is a spoof. This is not the real thing, although I have seen Haggadot for half-hour seders, 3-minute seders. This is a spoof, and I'll just read this aloud. It was in Slate. It was called The 2-Minute Haggadah, a Passover service for the impatient. The story of Passover. It's a long time ago. We're slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh is a nightmare. We cry out for help. God brings plagues upon the Egyptians. We escape, bake some matzah. We wander 40 years in the desert, eat manna, get the Torah, wind up in Israel, get a new temple, enjoy several years without being persecuted again. Let brisket cool now. So I rather love this one. We'll go on to the next slide. Every new event in Jewish history has, not every event, but many events in Jewish history that have been transformative to our lives, to our self-understandings, to our theologies, have been included in Haggadot. And here we see two images, one of a contemporary Haggadah, which reflects upon, on the left, David Wonder's Haggadah. It's a beautiful, startling image of life in the concentration camp. And on the right side, we see Haggadah that was used, if I believe correctly, if my memory is right, it's Yiddish. It was used in a DP camp. And as you can see, even the lettering reflects reflects really barbed wire, the shakiness of the time. Some of you may recall that back in the 70s and 80s, if you got a family Haggadah, one from the Reform movement, conservative movement, there was typically a section of the Haggadah which was devoted to Holocaust memory. Maybe you'll recall when Elie Wiesel told us that we should have a fifth cup, which was in memory of those who perished. And if you look at new Haggadot now, you very rarely see references to the Holocaust. and it's not because we don't remember, but I believe the rationale is that that when we had a lot of Holocaust material in Haggadah, it was addressing the absence of Holocaust remembrance occasions in the United States, and now that Holocaust remembrance days are set in our calendars, no longer does it become significant to put those memories into the Passover proceedings, so that it can have its own separate time. We'll go to the next image. So this is kind of fun, and maybe you know this story. When Obama was still in the President Obama was still in the primaries, he and his staff were in Philadelphia. It was the night of Passover, I believe, and his staff was saying, and they were putting together sort of a pickup kind of Seder in a hotel. And they said, if you're elected, really, Lishana Haba in the White House, next year in the White House. And lo and behold, not only did Obama get elected, but every year in the White House, he and Michelle Obama hosted a Passover Seder. You see them here with their daughters and staff members and other people. And the staff members were asked, well, which Haggadah do you want to use? And that year, there was a new Haggadah that came out called the New American Haggadah, which was written by Jonathan Safran Foer and translated by Stephen Englander, both very famous Jewish American authors, and with commentary by equally famous writers, including Lemony Snicket. And by the way, his parts are really, really funny. And so people were pushing, use that Haggadah in the White House. And the staffers said, no, we're going to be using the traditional Haggadah. And I hope you are all smirking right now, because and as you sort of look carefully at this image, that the traditional Haggadah that they use at the White House was the Maxwell House, alas. So yes, there was a Trump Passover Haggadah, and this year there is, I haven't seen it myself, but I've seen it advertised on Amazon. There is a Biden-Harris spoof Haggadah. We'll look at the next image. And this year, last year, practices that were included were those that were pertinent to our being alone and having Zoom Seders. Probably you will recall last March, I didn't own a mask. Probably you unless you worked in a hospital, you didn't either. We were just washing our hands like crazy. And when the first segments for Zoom Seder Haggadahs were put together, there was this little joke, which sort of was kind of funny at the time, which is that the order of the order of the Seder, which Seder means order, but this chant that we sing at the beginning, Kadesh Urchatz, saying each step along the way. This one went, by the way, the word Urchatz means and you wash. Rachza also means washing. So it's Kadesh Urchatz, Karpas Urchatz, Yachatz Urchatz, and so forth, sort of emphasizing how we were just washing and washing and washing. We'll go to the next image, please. Technologies have also been reflected in the proliferation of Haggadot. Here we see a Haggadah written on parchment, and this is in the earliest Haggadot were not self-standing books. They were incorporated in prayer books with other prayers. The next one, please. Next image. This reflects, certainly we see here the era of print. When once books could be printed, it was then possible for there to be inexpensive versions of the Haggadah, ones that people could use, have many at a table. They were cheap. The images were used over and over again. They got a little shabby over time, and the right image wasn't always with the right theme. There were pictures of Hannibal that were being used, pictures of Queen Esther, not exactly appropriate. And we'll move to the next image, please. And of course, there was the era of advertising. And we have, this is one of the earlier Maxwell houses. And on our right side, we have one of the more recent Maxwell houses. I thought this was going to be amazing because I was crazy about watching the marvelous Mrs. Maisel on TV. And the thought that Maxwell House was going to have a Midge's Haggadah just seemed so cute and so funny. And it does have an index card that's stuck in with Midge's brisket recipe. If you remember the plot, she made brisket in order to sort of to bribe the person at the comedy club so her husband could get in and try out his humor. It's not a great Haggadah. It's like there are a few sight gags, and you had to buy a whole big container of Maxwell House coffee. It's not like when you're at the grocery store and either you buy a Maxwell House coffee, or you just sort of think, well, they're free anyways, and there's just a big pile, and I could use a few more for my set. I'm sure that's how my family got most of its Maxwell House Haggadahs. We'll look at the next image. Now, of course, there are iPad, iPhone, computer Haggadot, and many people this year will want to be on the same page with their loved ones if they're still Zooming together. And I know not everybody has got vaccines. Not everyone in my family is vaccinated, so we're going to be Zoom Sedering this year once again. So it's very possible that you will use technology, and I think this is going to be a new practice as well, because there are many folks who before, say conservative Jews, who never used their computers before, their laptops or iPhones on Sabbath or holidays, but as of last year began to use it in order to be together. And it may be that having a Haggadah on one's laptop or phones, just so you can be together, might actually be done, and might be changing some of the practice, perhaps to revert to holding text in our hands next year when, God willing, we're all together. The next image, please. A characteristic, and this will be the last image I'll share, is a characteristic of the newest Haggadot is the social issue Haggadah. And there's a kind of, I'm sure you've seen these, you've seen either inserts or special Haggadot. The way these Haggadot work is there is an oppressive problem, like issues concerning race, issues concerning food insecurity, issues concerning refugees, migration, and so forth. And it is compared, the strategy is to compare that pressing social problem to the state of being enslaved, the Israelites being enslaved. And through the process of going through the Seder, moral indignation is aroused. And the solution to the problem comes about as there is an updated telling of the Exodus story. And typically, new symbols will be introduced. Perhaps in a pride Haggadah, there will be the symbol of a coconut, sticks and stones, certainly the orange once again. And at the end of the night, if the liturgy has worked, people feel not just a matter of, well, that was interesting, but they will feel, again, if it works, people will feel committed to acting on what they have learned, and also perhaps to support the organization that made this lovely, intellectually, socially, morally, ethically engaging Haggadah. So we'll come back to each other. Alma, thank you so much for sharing these images. So I would be delighted to answer in the time that we have remaining I would be delighted to answer any of your questions to the best of my ability.
So let me ask people to use the question and answer, and I'll be looking at those and summarizing them for Professor Oakes to respond to. But I'd like to take you up on your willingness to tell us what the orange, the meaning of the symbol of the orange is on the Seder plate today in the feminist Haggadah.
Sure. Well, that's the question. Thank you for asking that, Richard. That's the question that I'm asked most often. And I confess that this is so embarrassing that I tell this story one way in this book, and I tell the story in a slightly different way in my book called Inventing Jewish Ritual. And in both cases, I based my telling on what I thought was authoritative. So I think what I have in this book is authoritative, but let me be a little bit vague. So long ago, a group of lesbian Jews had been told, when in their studies, they were told that there was no place for lesbianism in Judaism, really no place. And their reaction was for their group Seder, was to put bread on the Seder plate. When Susanna Heschel heard about that, she thought this is not a great idea, because being a queer person is not like it's not a transgression. It's just different, and you belong. And she thought she had this idea that use a tangerine on your Seder plate, and that way, when you could spit out the seeds of the tangerine, you could spit out the seeds of homophobia, which is a great idea. Later, somehow, a story emerges, which Professor Susanna Heschel at Dartmouth University says never happened. That there was some rabbi who said to her that a woman on the bima, on the altar of a synagogue as a rabbi, belongs there as much as an orange on the Seder plate. And from that day on, people would put oranges on Seder plates to say, you bet we belong. So my story is probably kind of correct. It's the story of where it first happened, which is iffy. But I think the essential part that we should know is that it's a great thing that there is a very powerful symbol of Jewish belonging that's on our Seder plates, Jewish women's belonging. But it did begin with gay women thinking about their belonging. And it is rather unfortunate that that story has gotten eclipsed.
We have our first question coming from one of our colleagues, Andrea White, who writes, is the order always the same in Haggadot historically? Are there similar omissions in many Haggadot?
The order is the same. Kadesh Urchatz, ever since Rashi, the order has been the same. However, parts have been omitted, parts of it have been added. For instance, in the Reform movement in the early 1900s, there was just one long question instead of 4 questions. And the plagues were out. Plagues were not nice. And in the 1907 version of the Reform Haggadah, the plagues were back in. And so there have been dramatic inclusions and exclusions in the earliest kibbutz Haggadot. A great deal of the tradition was out, particularly in secular kibbutzim, and then with each new publication, more of the tradition came back in. So I would say the order is always the same, but there's a great deal that people simply excluded over time, either that they pulled it out of the Haggadah or they went over it. Sometimes what I found really interesting in the Reconstructionist Haggadah of Mordechai Kaplan, which was a really daring one, in which he initially takes out the plagues, he takes out the idea of chosen people. Many conservative Jews, rabbis in particular, really liked the text because it's so fresh and so of the moment. But they were used to the plagues, so they had one Haggadah with plagues. They had the Mordechai Kaplan one without the plagues, and they would go back and forth, which sort of characterizes what we've been doing at my house for many years, which is we have, until I recently created my gender neutral Haggadah with pictures of the grandchildren, which I now have. We used to have many Haggadot at the table, and we used the Hebrew school, what I used to call the Hebrew school Haggadah, the one with lines and numbered lines. We all had that one text so we could literally be on the same page. And then my guests were invited to go over to my coffee table and take a bundle of Haggadot, old and new, and put it next to them. You can imagine my table's already really filled up right now, and to use what they found inspirational when it was their time to read.
That's a fascinating answer. We've got a lot of very interesting questions for you to take up. So we have another person who has anonymous attendee. I wish I knew who this person was, because they ask a very, I think, important question. It's really two questions. They ask, obviously, as you've shown, Professor Oakes, the Haggadah has gone through many changes since its inception. And then here are the questions. What do you see as the bare bones essentials to a Passover Seder Haggadah? That's kind of going back to the skipping and zipping, perhaps. But
I love that question.
there's a second question, though. Let me read it. What are some of the Talmudic origins of the Haggadah?
Okay, let's do part one. You need matzah. You totally need matzah. You totally need maror. You need the bitter herbs. For better or for worse, we don't need to sacrifice an animal. We need the matzah. We need the bitter herbs, and we need a parent or an adult who knows the story of the Exodus. And we need a child or a student or another adult who will ask, "Tell me this story." And the one who knows the story tells the story. You eat matzah, you eat the bitter herbs. That, to me, you got it there. That way you have heard the story with your ears, you've told it with your mouth, and with the bitter herbs and the matzah, you remember it in an embodied, when you eat them, you remember it in an embodied way. That, to me, is the essence of Passover. And in the Talmud, it's all about the story. It's all about telling the story. One passage in Talmud says, if you have a child, tell the story to your child. If you have a student, tell the story to the student. If you have a wife, have her ask you a question, and you tell her the story as an answer. And if you don't have any of the above, you ask yourself a question, and you tell yourself the story as the answer. The Talmud has great suggestions for you should make sure your children nap. There should be snacks. There all kinds of wisdom, different kinds of questions, not the 4 questions that we know, and a lot of arguments in the Talmud. One of the questions is haroset, the sort of usually the apple nut or the dried fruit and nut mix that we have for our Hillel sandwich. Is it a mitzvah? It's like is it a mitzvah? like it seems to be a commandment, it seems to be obligatory, but there they are in the Talmud, the different rabbis over different generations, they're arguing with each other, and they come up with the best solution. So by the way, you don't go to the Talmud to find a mini Haggadah. There's all kinds of discussions. But the solution is Pukazeh, go outside and look, and you will see that there is a merchant who is calling out, get your ingredients for haroset, get your ingredients for the mitzvah of haroset. It's like, oh, so it must be a mitzvah if the merchant is selling these items and people are clamoring for them, which says to us a lot about something that we don't often think about, is the role that real everyday people, families, cooks, makers of the Seder, merchants, the role that we play, not just the rabbis, but everyday people, that we play a role in creating any holidays ritual.
Another question from another one of our colleagues here is, and there's a kind of astonishment after listening to you in this question. How did it happen in the first place that the Haggadah is so flexible?
Oh, wow. One could write a book about that, and maybe I did. I think the reason I think it's so flexible is that there's only one thing that needs to be done, is a story needs to be told. And by mistake, our people that loves books and loves liturgy so much, we kept adding and adding and adding and holding on to what we had already put there, and we got hung up on it, and we loved it, and we forgot what the point was, which was to tell a story. I think the other thing that happened is people lost sight of the story and began to tell the Haggadah as opposed to the story. They lost confidence in themselves as storytellers and began to turn the ritual into an idol.
Yeah.
And the text into an idol. And the real problem with this text that we've acquired, which, look, any of you who are scholars, any of you who are ritual experts, who've been leading rituals in your families for years, you know how to use a Haggadah to make it work. But what most people don't know is that it's a book that is you're meant to prepare to use it. You're meant to select from it that which will speak to your audience, so to speak. It's a book that requires an expert teacher, and we're not expert teachers. So essentially what people end up doing is they end up reading the lesson plan. You picture being a third grade teacher reading her lesson plan to the class, or reading his lesson plan to the class, and it's just like, it's not teaching, it's not learning. But we have, unfortunately, and I mean, good for publishers of Haggadot. The reason they keep getting published is because the old ones just don't work.
Wonderful answer. Now, we have another question from one of our participants who says, do the Jewish communities in Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere incorporate the same American-style social justice innovations in their Seder practices and Haggadot? Or do they observe Passover in a more traditional way?
I think it depends on what community it is. If it's an Orthodox community, they're going to be using a fairly traditional Haggadah. If it's a liberal community, they are going to be addressing contemporary social issues. I mean, we really do it a lot in America. We really have the social justice thing going on at a fever pitch. more now than ever. So I presume it's more trendy in America to add readings that address social justice issues. It's also more trendy in America, at least before COVID, was to have seders before Passover or during Passover, sort of taking up that theme of the third Seder that was popular among Jewish socialist groups in the 20th century. It's probably more typical of Americans to have these extra seders using different special social justice Haggadah. In Israel, however, I know that Haggadah, which have dealt with refugees, is done. It is definitely done.
We have a question from Rabbi Ira Udovin, who asks, do you accept the theory that the Seder is patterned on a Greek symposium?
I think everybody accepts that one. I think everybody, I've never heard of anyone who has dismissed that. It makes a lot of sense. There's this notion of learned people sitting around with food, lounging, a little bit of one-upsmanship there, a little bit of showing off, lots of wine. And the Seder plate is sort of like reminds one of the little tables that the people at a symposium would have with their food on it. What the Seder doesn't have is dancing girls and entertainment, which is characteristic of certain symposia. Ours is a much more, a far more chaste rendering of what could have been somewhat wild.
Now there's another question here that I think connects to Rabbi Udovin's question, and that is, what is the earliest time and place of a Seder? And I might add to this a question that I've had. Do you think that the supper that Jesus celebrated with his disciples was a Seder meal? Was a Seder ritual?
So there's an argument about, I'll answer the second part first. There's an argument about that. There are some scholars who believe that it was a Seder meal, and there are others who say absolutely not. What was present at that meal? There was wine and there was bread that was broken. Well, if you've observed any Jewish holiday, including the Sabbath, there is always wine and there is always bread that is broken. And so there isn't, those people would say there just isn't enough evidence that it was Passover. When was the first Seder? It was sometime after there was no longer sacrifice possible. When it was no longer possible to come to gather in Jerusalem, and when Passover could no longer be a pilgrimage holiday, which had nothing to do with sitting around your table reading from a book. It was about coming together. It was about national solidarity. It was moving. It was all those feelings. If you think about the feelings of making Hajj and coming together as a nation, that used to be our Passover. And when the rabbis and probably people as well came up with a table alternative, it was a strategy, and it was creating what is Judaism. It was a strategy for creating a brand new religion that functioned using symbols, stories, and texts.
You know, that's an extraordinary place to end our discussion with you, Vanessa. But I want to do that by pointing out that at the end of this extraordinary book that you've made for us, you raise the issue of the Haggadah to an entirely different plane at the very end. And you write, and I don't know whether you want to answer this question that you pose at the end of the book, or you want to let it be a kind of hook to invite other people to read what you wrote. But you write here at the end, as this life of the Haggadah reaches its conclusion, I want to share the questions that has fueled my investigation and reflect on how I am, for now, responding to it. Why has the Haggadah needed so much revision? I believe it is because the Haggadah holds within its DNA, so to speak, 3 imperfections. And of course, you say what the imperfections are, but the idea that somehow this book, the Haggadah, is more important, more significant than simply a book that's used at a meal in the spring, is really an extraordinary argument that you present at the very end of this book.
Well, Richard, I am not going to answer that question because you have made my scholarship seem interesting and intriguing, and I don't want to give away the plot. So I think I've hinted at all. I think I've hinted at these imperfections in my presentation. The only one I haven't hinted at is a theological flaw, which would take too long to describe in full. But yeah, this is the place where my book ends up, where I explore these deep imperfections, but see them as blessings of a sort that lead us as a people, and all parts of the people, not just the sagey parts, but like the everyday, all of us people, to continue to wrestle and create this book. I just want to thank you so much for spending time with me on this beautiful afternoon. I hope that your Passover holidays, if you observe the holiday, will be rich and fulfilling. I hope that you will find from your local bookstore or from Princeton University Press my book. I hope you will. I hope you'll enjoy it. It's not a terribly long read. It is longer than many Haggadot, but not as long as others.
I can assure you that if you go to Chaucer's and you pick up Vanessa's book, you will remember it the rest of your life. And you'll always think about it at your Passover Seders. So Vanessa, let me just thank you for spending the afternoon with us and telling us about this extraordinary book. I want to tell people that if you have friends who you want to make sure hear this presentation, it will be available on our website probably by Tuesday before Passover. That's at taubman.ucsb.edu. And you'll be able to see the whole presentation once again. And let me remind you also that our next Taubman event will be on Wednesday, the 7th of April. I want to underscore it's on Wednesday, the 7th of April, because that's the day before Yom HaShoah, and we'll be having a presentation by David Marwell on his book on Mengele, the unveiling of the angel of death. So Vanessa, let me thank you again for this stunning presentation of your book. We enjoyed it, and we hope that at some point you'll be able to come to Santa Barbara. I think many of us would drive to LA to bring you here and return you.
With giant onions,
We have other giant things as well, corn, etc. Thank you very much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.
Chag Sameach
Chag Sameach to everybody.
Chag Sameach to everyone. Bye-bye.